Welcome back to the channel, y'all. I am Miss Titus, and tonight we're going to learn how to debate Black atheists. All right, first off, just wanted to give a shout out to the live chat. If you are here, please go ahead and give this video a thumbs up. I'm super excited about tonight because we're going to be talking to one of the contributors of the Urban Apologetics book. So
get ready, girl. Get ready. Get ready.
Welcome to the channel, Adam Coleman. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. I didn't see that coming, you know. So
I'm a little bit corny around it. This is the corny side of apologetics.
No, hey, comedy is good though. Comedy is good. You got to add a little comedy in there. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like sugar with medicine. You know, it's good. It's good.
Life is boring without laughter. That's how I feel about it.
There it is. That's right.
Right. So I brought you here because you contributed to this here fine book, Urban Apologetics. Can you explain to us what exactly is urban apologetics?
For sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me on the channel. You know, it's a pleasure to be here. And so urban apologetics, I think some people, define it slightly differently. I look at it as being kind of the area of study and the practice of responding to objections to and questions about Christianity within the African American context and other minority contexts as well. So I think what throws a lot of people off is the term urban. And obviously we're not saying we're just doing apologetics in a particular urban area like in the hood or something like that. But apologetics being essentially giving a defense of the faith, and then the urban part really speaks to the fact that many of the ideologies that we contend with in the African American context kind of sprang out of urban context. So that's kind of why we term it as being urban apologetics. Right.
Awesome. So your chapter of the book focused on Black atheism. Can you tell us why you chose to write on that subject?
So there's a couple reasons. For one, it's actually kind of like a pet project of mine, to take some of the arguments for God's existence and pair them with African American thinkers, who I think have kind of framed certain arguments and ideas in a way that if we can kind of just, look at their works for the intellectual merit that we should take them in, we can really beef up what they were saying and kind of pair some of the arguments for God's existence with people like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Zara Yacob, and people that we'll probably talk about here in a minute. So as kind of like a pet project, it was just like one of those things where I wanted to, I would just put it real. I wanted to present the blackest defense of Christianity against atheism possible. That's really what I wanted to do. I felt like that was something that hadn't been done before. And I just wanted to, it was almost like William Lane Craig meets Cornel West. That's kind of what I wanted to capture, in the chapter. So aside from that, though, I do think that atheism is a worldview that doesn't get enough attention in the African American context, or Africans of the diaspora more broadly. And I felt like it needed to be addressed because the God question is not something that can really be taken for granted. When it comes to worldviews and understanding the way the world is and some of the crucial questions that we grapple with, we can't leave the God question out. And that was something that I really wanted to key in on. And if I'm being real, there's a personal aspect of it. As I mentioned right at the beginning of my chapter, my sister is an atheist. At least she was at the time where, when I wrote the book. And so, quite frankly, like a lot of what I do is, when I'm doing ministry, whether it be atheism or whatever, I'm trying to minister in the same way that I hope somebody is ministering to her. And so it was just kind of like that personal connection that really drew me into focusing in on atheism in the African American context. Yeah.
Do you find yourself debating a lot of non-Christians, like, I don't know, in the barbershop or just out and about? Because it just seems like today everybody just hates Christianity so much.
I do. I think part of it, I'm not sure. I think it is the culture. I think there is a lot out there as far as angst against Christianity. Yeah. But then I think I probably have to take ownership too. Like I'm naturally contentious. That's just the way so it's partly me. Like, I'm very laid back. I like to joke and that kind of stuff, but also I think it's just the way that I'm wired. I don't mind having contentious conversations as long as it's not getting personal. So I think I kind of invite those conversations. So I can't tell if I find myself in these situations because I put myself there, or if it just is what it is. But just growing up in a typical black community. Like every barbershop, you're gonna hear about sports, the Bible, and a few other things that I won't mention, on your channel. But religion is always gonna come up, and so unfortunately, most of the time in those contexts, like you don't really have people who are well versed in why they believe what they believe with respect to Christianity. And I've just kind of made it my business to not be that way. I feel like if you're going to hold to something, you ought to know why it is that you believe it and be able to give an account for it.
Have you ever personally dealt with your own doubts in God or Christianity?
Yeah, the reality is I have. So, I won't take up your whole
Yeah.
uh interview with my origin story, so to speak, but really how I got into apologetics. I came up in a word of faith background. And just to keep it short, like, by God's grace, he brought me out of that, and started correcting my doctrine and things like that. But around that same time, I really did encounter some real tragedies, in terms of, my wife and I, we experienced her having a miscarriage and things of that nature. Um, and at the time, it was a real grappling with the problem of evil. And it just so happened that around that same time, my dad, just out of the blue, really, looking back on it, was God looking out. But he sent me like 4 or 5 books on apologetics, just like randomly, William Lane Craig's On Guard, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Frank Turek, Norm Geisler joint, a couple of different books. And I was just eating them up. And it is really through studying apologetics that it helped me to navigate the problem of evil that I was encountering in my own life. And so as I was experiencing those doubts and wondering about God's existence, God met me there with apologetics, which is really one of the main reasons I'm so passionate about it now, because I can see it in my own walk with Christ, how God, preserved me through it. So absolutely.
And that's a blessing to have parents, or at least your father, say, like, listen, here's some tools to help you deal with your own doubts and also be able to defend the faith against other people. Because my parents didn't know anything about apologetics until I got into apologetics.
Right.
And
The funny thing about it, I don't mean to cut you off. The funny thing about it, I didn't find this out until my grandfather passed a couple months ago, and I didn't find this out until maybe a month or so before he passed. But it was actually my grandfather that introduced my dad to apologetics, and then my dad, introduced me to it. So it's just crazy how God works, man. Like, God really moved through my family in that way. So I'm thankful.
Generational apologists. I like that. And it looks like you have some fans here in the live chat, Mr.
Oh,
Phil
cool.
Fox.
Phil Feezy. What's going on, Phil Fox? What's happening with you?
What's up? And you know what? I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with the Unspoken movie, but I know you recently appeared in that. What was that experience like?
Oh man, it was awesome, man. So yeah, we do have the Unspoken Documentary. Shout out to Lisa Fields of Jude 3, for backing that up and you're putting that out. Shout out to my man Don Carey. But it was pretty awesome actually, because my man Don, he decided to put the documentary out, and he was like, "Hey man, you want to be a part of it?" I'm like, "Yeah." So I was like, I was blessed to be in it. It's like, "Yo, you want me to be a hype man or whatever?" I'm with it. And they allowed me to just kind of speak on Christianity in Africa, prior to the transatlantic slave trade, and a number of other things that actually made it into the final cut of the documentary. So it's just a blessing, because I mean, you know how it is. I mean, when we first started doing this kind of stuff, there really wasn't a lot of resources to respond to things like, the Hidden Colors, documentary, and, a lot of things that we see on YouTube and social media. There just wasn't a lot of resources. So to be a part of that, as a resource where somebody can just sit down, and maybe they're not like a reader type, but they can just kind of sit down and watch the documentary and get real facts, like real documentation, addressing this such a critical issue. It's been pretty powerful, man. So I'm still, to be honest with you, I hate to sound corny, but it's kind of surreal, to be honest with you. It hasn't really hit me yet.
Man, there's some heavy hitters in that documentary, because it's like, it's you. I think Jackie Hill Perry's in there. I think Pastor Bates. Some people from the bodega. Shout out to the bodega.
Yeah, Dame is up in there. Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, it was
bad too. Yeah.
To see that, like, because we really do need to have a good response to these arguments, which kind of leads me into my next question. How has atheism typically like affected the Black community? Is this something that's kind of more current, or has this always been accepted in our history?
Yeah, so generally speaking, the idea of a black person being atheist has been relatively like taboo. It's really socially out of step with African and African American culture. So it really hasn't held sway, very much. It's not to say that there weren't people who were atheists, in the black community. It's not, we can't quarantine atheism like in Europe or something like that. You know what I mean? But it just really hasn't been a prominent idea. I do think that. Um, Over time, the idea has kind of endured, unfortunately, and I think that it is kind of cropping up in ways that we haven't seen it before,
Mhm.
due to social media and people how they use their public platforms. But certainly in America, you don't really see it, very much. Obviously, like in slave narratives and things of that nature, but um, with the turn of the century, moving into the 1900s, certainly moving into that era where you have the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance, you do begin to see these ideas of atheism and humanism cropping up and finding their place in the writings of people like Zora Neale Hurston or Claude McKay and people like that. And so certainly in the Harlem Renaissance, you start to see these ideas cropping up. But for the most part, how black people do is like, if you don't go to church, like, you're a weirdo or something. Like, what you mean you don't go to church? It's kind of one of those things. But we can't dismiss it. I mean, it's definitely a real thing, and we have to address it for sure.
I'm glad you said that because me and you, we talked about some of these TikTok atheists or whatever.
Right.
And I thought it would be kind of fun to play some TikToks and look at them because
Cool.
there was a guy who kind of he feels pressured into saying that he's a Christian because he's an atheist. Anyway, I'm butchering what I'm trying to say, but
No, that's cool. That's cool.
I'll let the video speak for itself. Let me see if I can pull it up here.
All right.
Weird and isolating this is. So when I was talking about being a black atheist being weird and isolating, this is specifically what I meant. But it's like 97% of black people have some form of faith or belief in God or higher power. It's not like I'm walking into church or religious functions and being like, hey, like, let's talk about it. I'm an atheist. I'm here. It's any kind of social function. For example, I do tech for a show called Don't Pass the Pepper Sauce. It's a Caribbean sketch comedy show. Everybody, crew and actors and all, get together and they pray in a circle. And a lot of moments happen like this at different social functions. And it's either A, you lie, you just say you're a Christian, you participate, no one questions it. It's not like you say you're a Christian, everyone pulls out their Bible for theological discourse. They just nod, move on, and continue with the social moment. Or B, you're just like, hey, this isn't exactly my thing, so I think I'll hang back. And people immediately start questioning you. You get ostracized instantly. Why don't you believe in God? It's something having to do with the church. I really hope God finds you. I'll pray for you. And you're no longer made welcome. It's weird to me that you think that you were the one who would have to figure out how to navigate being around me because that's what I'm always doing.
Wow. Okay.
Thoughts, because yeah.
Right. Well, I think there's a couple things that can be said there. I mean, first of all, I don't think that we want to, in any case, we don't want to like put something on a particular group of people and act as if it's only them when it's something that can be attributed to all people groups. And what I mean by that is this: all cultures have norms. You know what I'm saying? All cultures have social norms. All cultures have common ideas amongst people groups, and so forth. And so to put it this way, let's say, for example, you walk into a group of black people, right? And you say, let's say that you came up in the 80s and 90s and you say, I've never seen the movie Coming to America. Yeah, what I mean? People are gonna be like, well, like what? Like what's wrong with you? What you mean you ain't seen Coming to America? And then they're gonna, yeah, how? Right? Then they're gonna start running down the list to kind of to check your black card. They're gonna ask about other black people. All right, well, have you seen Friday? Have you seen, The Color Purple? Have you seen, like, they're gonna do all that kind of stuff, Juice or whatever it may be. Now, I'm kind of joking because those are movies, but it's really the same response. I'm saying there's some sort of cultural norm and expectation that you have not met, and people are going to respond like that. It might be like, I know when I don't know if it's still this way now, but when I went off to college, if you didn't play spades, you know what I mean, then it was like, oh, like you don't play spades, like what's wrong with you? You know what I mean? That's an expectation among black people, right? So when it comes to the kind of response that he's talking about, it's not just people who go to church or people who subscribe to Christianity that respond that way. All cultures have norms and social expectations, and when you find yourself in a position where you don't seem to meet those, then they respond like that. With that being said, I don't want to minimize the experience, but at the same time, it's like if somebody says to you, man, I hope that God finds you, I hope that, or they ask out of some genuine concern that you have some sort of church hurt, I mean, honestly, if that's the way that they should respond, right? I've even heard some atheists, like I think it was Penn from Penn and Teller say something similar, where it's like, if you're a Christian and you really honestly believe that if I don't accept Jesus as Lord, then I will be eternally out of fellowship with Him. You know what I'm saying? I'll put it that way. Then, if you don't tell me about it, something like you just a terrible person. You know, you literally have a moral obligation to tell people, you know, the good news, in the same way that if somebody was in the street about to get hit by a truck, if you don't say anything when you could, then there's really something wrong with you morally. And so I think that I can understand why maybe he might feel awkward in certain situations. I don't want to undermine that. But at the same time, if somebody's asking you out of genuine concern about something like that, then I think honestly, on a moral level, it's consistent with their worldview to do so. Like that's exactly what we should expect of somebody who is responding to somebody who they believe might need Jesus. I mean, that's kind of what it is.
You know what I find hilarious is everybody's stuck on this comment about spades. Never
Oh.
could spades.
Right.
Detroit says spades is his game, and
Of course.
says spades is hard to learn. Spades is like,
come on, you got to get right.
Yeah, like what are y'all even doing? After this live, everybody go learn how to play spades. Period.
Right. If you go to a cookout and they playing spades and you can't hop in there, it's like, oh man, I've seen married couples literally get into like real arguments. You know what I'm saying, like if one of them renege or something like that. It's like, man, spades is serious. You know what I'm saying?
It is, and it is. Man, I got family members to this day like, nah, I don't mess with you, sis, because I remember that game from 8 years ago. Give me about another 2 years and we might be all right again. Right.
You better be counting them cards right.
But earlier I asked you about, you know, your own personal doubts. And in the book, you talked about a philosopher from, I think you said Ethiopia, and his name was
that's right.
Zira Yacob. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah. So, actually one day I was just doing a random search on African philosophers, and I came across him in the, I think it was the Blackwell Companion to African Philosophy. He was a Ethiopian Christian. You know, or at least he was born into a Christian community in the 17th century. And essentially what you had was, at the time where he was living, you had the native Ethiopians were coming into trade relationships with the Portuguese. And there was just a lot of friction at the time, particularly along religious lines. You know, there was a lot of friction there, to the extent where it's almost like you could have somebody, if you told the king or some official that somebody was speaking against them, you know, they would just go and yoke you up and it'd just be a rap. You know, it was just real tense like that. And so somebody actually did that to him, basically put out a false report, and his life was threatened. So he dipped out, stayed in a cave for 2 years, and just kind of reflected on just some real existential issues, just, you know, the problem of evil, the existence of God, and a number of other things. And then eventually he emerged from that cave, you know, and later on his thoughts and ideas were recorded by one of his students, Zelda Haywat. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but it was recorded in a book called the Hatatta. And so in one of the chapters of the Hatatta, he actually lays out, you know, how he was wrestling with the problem of evil, as specifically around like slavery and just the evil of man. And in the course of doing so, he began to ponder arguments for God's existence.
Wow.
Yeah.
It sounds like he was a fan of the Book of Psalms, which is
interesting,
that's right. Because, you know, so many people think that Christianity was like, Africans did not know anything about the Bible until slavery, and it sounds like this happened. Was it a little bit before slavery? Or I really don't know the timeline. You said
so this would be like the 1600s. So you did have slavery going on. There wasn't and one of the things that he does lament in his work is you know, people being enslaved, but it wasn't the Portuguese just kind of running up in Africa, just, you know, snatching up people and selling them. Unfortunately, as it was even in West Africa, there were some African countries that had trade relationships where they were trafficking people. You know, that's just the reality of it. But to your point, he does talk about in the Tata that he fled to this cave with nothing but, I think he said, 2 pounds of gold and the Book of Psalms. You know, and so it's very interesting as he's grappling with the problem of evil. You know, why is there such evil in the world, particularly in terms of how people treat each other? He really reflects on the Psalms a bit and kind of draws from the words of David to pretty much provide a foundation for some of the arguments for God's existence that he develops.
So he's questioning himself, like, where did my ears come from? I'm like, where did
Yeah.
yeah, I learned a little bit. I enjoyed your chapter.
Okay, all right, cool. Yeah, that's you checked it out. That's what's up. That's what's up.
I'm just saying, philosophy. I never took a philosophy class when I was in college, but I feel like I got a nice dose of it in that chapter. Another thing that you brought up was the contingency argument. So can you kind of break that down for us a little bit?
Yeah, I can kind of give it in snippet form, and then hopefully people will check the book out and take a look at it further. But one of the things that we found in Zara Jacobs' work, saying, yeah, there we go, Urban Apologetics, restoring Black dignity with the gospel. Also, before I forget, I just don't want to forget this. They actually volume 2 of Urban Apologetics is dropping on June 20th this year. So people definitely want to check that out. Go ahead and get the first one. It's available now, and then get the second one. But yeah, in the Hatada, you have Zara Jacob pretty much giving like a succinct argument for God's existence. I think it's in chapter 3, I believe, of the Hatada. And one of the things he includes in there is a version of the cosmological argument, right? So typically, there's a whole bunch of different flavors of the cosmological argument. For those, my philosophy nerds out there, you're probably familiar with like the Kalam and stuff like that. But typically, cosmological arguments will come in 2 parts. So the first part is usually establishing that there's some sort of fundamental cause, or explanation for everything. And then the second phase of the argument is going to be examining, what that cause must be like, or what that explanation, what can we discern about it, right? Shout out to my man Zion. What's happening with you?
Zion also put a chapter in the book, by the way.
He did. Oh, he killed it. Absolutely. Yeah. Zion. Yeah. Shout out to Zion, man. Did his thing with the chapter as well. And so basically, as it goes, he was examining the idea that, kind of like where do I come from? You hear him kind of just, go down this list of causes. Like, okay, well, I came from my parents, but they came from their parents, and then the parents' parents and parents' parents' parents, kind of on down the line, until you eventually arrive at like basically the material stuff that we're made of. He kind of worded it in a particular way like that. And basically what he's getting at is that everything seems to need an explanation, right? To put it in, to bring in another philosopher by the name of Gottfried Leibniz, is this notion of, why does anything exist? Why is there something rather than nothing? This seems to be the question that Zara Jacob was pursuing. And so the idea is that everything seems to have an explanation. But if you look at like ourselves, the explanation for why we exist lies outside of ourselves, and most things seem to be like that, whether it be, the computer that I'm talking into, this microphone, or, this book, they all have explanations as to why they exist that rely upon something outside of themselves. The problem is that if everything is like that, then you end up with this infinite number of things that exist, but there's no particular explanation as to why any of it all exists. There's no like stopping point, if you will, And so Zara Jacob, to use some of Leibniz's terminology, I think what he surmised is that there must be some other kind of thing, some other type of entity that does not require a explanation outside of itself. Now we're going to get into a little philosophy here, but the term for that would be a necessary being or a necessary entity. So a necessary entity or a necessary being is something that exists, but the explanation for its existence is within itself. It doesn't rely upon anything outside of itself to exist. Some philosophers think like, numbers and moral truths or whatever would fall in that category. Contingent things would be like everything else, like stuff that I talked about, like you, me, the computer, microphone, whatever, things that rely upon something outside of themselves for why they exist. So from that, you can actually draw like an argument that kind of captures what it was that Zara Jacob and I think Leibniz are both trying to say. And it kind of goes like this. I'll just kind of read out the 4 steps. And then, like I said, people can kind of check out, the rest of it in the book. But, everything that exists, I was to say premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature, as in terms of inside itself, or an external cause. That's premise 1. Premise 2, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then that explanation is God, right? Premise 3, the universe exists. And then that leads to the conclusion, therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. And so in the book, I go into each of those premises and give like 4 or 5 different arguments for like the first one and a couple arguments for the second and third premise to bring you to that conclusion. But in snippet form, when you think about it, we're pretty much setting a low bar here. I mean, to think that everything has an explanation for its existence, that's a pretty low bar, right? I mean, like we don't believe that things just kind of pop into existence for no reason. You know what I'm saying? When you think about the idea of something coming from nothing and no reason, I mean, just at the outset, it's pretty nonsensical. We don't believe that things just pop into existence that way. But also, if somebody has a problem with that, then they would have to accept the idea that something can come from nothing and for no reason. And that would really undermine science, because science relies upon regularity in the universe and things of that nature, and being able to observe things with consistency. But that goes out the window if any and everything can just kind of pop into existence for no reason, from nothing. And then thirdly, if for some reason somebody would want to negate like the first premise, they would have to think that, well, even the thoughts in your head could just pop into being for no reason. Like, you may not really be reasoning or listening to me right now. It could just be thoughts popping into your head. You know what I mean? This gets into kind of philosophical stuff that kind of makes you dizzy, but nevertheless, it's just kind of stacks up to say, what, it is pretty reasonable to think that things have an explanation for their existence. And it's also plausible, or reasonable to think that they can be divided into those two categories I mentioned before. Last thing I'll say about it, when it comes to that second premise of, if the explanation of the universe, if the universe has an explanation, then it would have to be God. It gets into like, what do we mean by universe? By universe, most scientists mean something like time, space, matter/energy. But if something is an explanation for the universe, then it would have to be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and enormously powerful. And when it comes to things that are timeless and spaceless and immaterial, you pretty much in philosophical literature have two options. You either have abstract objects or an unembodied mind. Abstract objects would be like things like the number 3 and stuff like that, which can't cause anything by definition. So you're just left with an unembodied mind in terms of your options there, which, that's what we refer to as God. So usually I say to people on premise 3, if you have a problem with the claim that the universe exists, then I don't even think we need to have a discussion at that point, because you got a whole different issue. But with those 3 premises kind of lightly touched on, we have reason to think that you can get to that conclusion that God is indeed the explanation of the universe.
Yeah, it's like, for me, and I think a lot of the other Christian apologists in the chat, we feel as though the onus is on the atheist to explain, okay, if we're putting out the possibility of miracles, then just at the beginning, at the start of everything, where does the universe come from? And sometimes I feel like they like to duck out of it by saying, well, it's eternal. But science tells us that it's not eternal. Shout out to Frank Turek. You mentioned that book earlier.
Yeah, for sure.
I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. If the universe came into existence, then it had to have been caused by something. So it sounds like Zero Yacob, hundreds of years ago, had already started kind of thinking about these things.
Yeah, it seems like it. And actually, some of the work that I'm doing now, I'm actually looking to a similar argument that St. Augustine made in some of his writings. So that's going back, even further, centuries even further. But to your point, I mean, I do think that, and I think this gets into the question of why it is that I do believe that atheism is hurtful to the Black community, is that when you think about it, worldviews are meant to explain things. Like, you're trying to understand the world in the way that it is, right? Well, if existence itself, if you can't even get off the ground with a solid answer to that, then you're already, kind of behind the 8 ball. You're already starting off on the wrong foot. And I don't think that atheism can give a good account for why things exist. But that aside, the reality is, if we take God off the table, then there's a bunch of other things that get taken off the table too. I do think it's the case that God is the best explanation for morality, human dignity, consciousness, and a bunch of other things. But just to kind of keep it succinct, like concepts like justice, I think are best explained in terms of how we encounter justice by the existence of God. So if you take God off the table, then these moral and conceptual realities that are really fixtures of the African-American tradition, I think you have to toss them out as well, right? So whether it be somebody like a Martin Luther King, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, when we think about why these people are significant, they're significant because they're morally significant. They were involved in a moral struggle. I just wrote an article on Sojourner Truth last week. Why is she significant in African-American history? Because she was involved in a moral struggle. But if there is no solid grounding for morality, then it really takes the steam out of people like that in terms of that aspect of African American heritage and legacy. And so there's a bunch of problems I think come along with not being able to account for reality and taking God out of the picture.
Yeah, because it makes you wonder, like, how can an atheist say things like racism or slavery or some of these other words? And I'm not going to stay on the YouTube algorithm.
Right,
Right, like I can't say some of those, but y'all, like some of the really bad things that have happened just to black people in this country. Like,
yeah.
without God, how can we justifiably call those things wrong? Right.
Yeah, exactly. I think that many atheists have tried. I think there's many frameworks out there, attempting to ground morality without God. I just don't think that they're any good. I don't think that they're very successful. And I think that there are some atheists like Thomas Nagel, like a Frank Johnson, who just kind of bite the bullet of their atheism and say, you know what, guys. We just got to give it up. If God doesn't exist, then we have to stop deluding ourselves that things like morality are real. Like I said a second ago, I just wrote an article last week for the Premier Unbelievable platform on this issue of justice. And what you have is, I'll be super quick with it, but there's this famous statement by Friedrich Nietzsche, that God is dead, and it's drawn from his work called the Madman, which is kind of like a parable in which you have this guy who's an atheist talking to a village of other atheists. And he's basically saying, like, yo, y'all tripping. Like, if we're going to be real about God not being in the picture, then we've got to get rid of objectivity when it comes to meaning and morality and purpose and all these other things. And the fact that you're still trying to hold on to it is inconsistent, essentially, with this world, like an atheistic worldview, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty profound because I think that he's right. So when you think about the African American experience, if you're really going to be consistent, with your atheism, then I think you do have to get rid of the moral dimension of our history as being in any way significant. I think that Dr. King is no more meaningful than Bull Connor. You know what I mean? Like, both of what they did is on equal footing, essentially, if you take God out of the picture. So anyway, I think there's a lot of cost there, when it comes to atheism, if you adopt that view.
That's pretty scary. And it leads to the next TikTok. Mm-hmm. All right. So I think this one is a little bit longer, but y'all bear with sis, okay?
Okay.
Conversation the other day with a Christian who couldn't understand how I got from super religious person to existential nihilism. For those who don't know, existential nihilism is basically the belief that life has no inherent meaning and there is no grand reason as to why we are all here. We simply just are. So I came on here to explain my journey in hopes that it will resonate with a few. I've been through 3 religions. I was born and raised into Islam. I converted to Christianity in my teens, and for a brief period in 2016, I was a Scientologist. I've also been a super woke SJW for the majority of my 20s, but I've also been incredibly inquisitive. I've always questioned things. I strayed away from religion in 2013 after becoming woke about black people and our history and stuff, and so Christianity became the white man's religion. Around this time, I was getting into cyberpunk, a science fiction genre that imagines the future through a very dark dystopian lens. The premise is usually centered around a society that has gone through the process of accelerated capitalism, which has led to government corporations, aka the ruling class, essentially running Earth under a totalitarian regime. Or it's usually about artificial intelligence going rogue. Think The Matrix, Terminator, Blade Runner, Ghost in the Shell, iRobot, etc. I started to feel hopeless about the future, which led me to feeling hopeless about life itself. I didn't realize that I was already an existential nihilist at this point. It sounds weird, but I genuinely thought that I was living in a dystopia, and this led to suicidal thoughts. This is what typically an existential nihilist goes through at the start. Feelings of dread, pessimism, a feeling of impending doom. After a few years, I tried to ignore it, which is partially why the brief moment with Scientology was even able to happen. But these feelings were always still at the back of my mind. It wasn't until the pandemic that I realized what I was experiencing. Finding not just a name, but a whole school of thought in philosophy to explain what I was feeling gave me a huge sense of relief. What was even more relieving was discovering absurdism, which can be traced back to the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard and was popularized by the philosopher Albert Camus. In part 2, I'm going to explain what absurdism is, how this perspective freed me and basically helped me to accept my meaningless existence.
I know that was a lot.
Yeah, that's a shame. That's a real shame, man. Ideas have consequences.
Mhm.
That's the reality. But ideas matter. Ideas have consequences. So I do think is the case. I find it interesting that she mentioned Albert Camus, because if I'm not mistaken, I think it was him that kind of posed the idea that the only serious, like, philosophical question is, why should we not commit suicide?
Mm.
Which is really deep, considering her even attesting herself that was something that she struggled with. But the reality is, here's the thing: if it is true that everything that exists, including ourselves, came into existence from nothing, for nothing, by nothing, and eventually will pretty much return to nothing, at least functionally, because you have the heat death of the universe that's kind of looming in the background, which will occur eventually, where there's no usable energy in the universe, and so everything is going to revert to nothing, functionally speaking. If all of that is true, and that's all we have to say about reality, then sure, I think it is the case that meaning, or at least objective meaning and objective purpose, really do go out the window.
Mhm.
And if such is the case, then I think that you are left with a picture that I don't know how you square it with anything other than hopelessness. But I think that when you're comparing worldviews, one of the tests of a worldview is livability. Like, can you live it out? Can you really live as though your life has no meaning? Can you really live consistently, as if morality doesn't exist and nothing ultimately matters? I don't think you can. And I also think that you're faced with certain problems. Like, again, I'm going to take it back to our history, here in the African diaspora. If it is true that everything is meaningless, then you do end up with this kind of picture. Well, man, why fight for abolition? Like, why fight against Jim Crow? Like, I mean, like, what's the point anyway? Like, we're all going to end up at nothing. Like, nothing matters anyway. This is an interesting exchange, and I'll be quick with this. But I just wrote about this last week. But there was, I think it was in 1852. Frederick Douglass was doing making a speech at an abolitionist conference, and he had pretty much taken up the view that at that point he believed that the only thing that would solve the slavery problem in America was bloodshed. It seems to me that Sojourner Truth, who was in the audience that day, a great abolitionist in her own right, seemed to interpret that as being him kind of giving up on God's way of pursuing justice. And so in mid speech, she actually interrupts him and asks the question, well, Frederick, is God dead? Is God dead? And it was kind of like this implication of, well, if God is dead, then all right, cool. We just left to our own devices. Just do whatever. I mean, we got to take matters into our own hands. But if God is not dead, then that, then you have a framework to work from that does compel one towards pursuing justice and pursuing it in a way that accords with an objective moral framework and so forth. So I feel really bad for that young lady, man. I do think that if you just bite the bullet of atheism, then I do think that the only thing you're left with is a picture of hopelessness. But I think that picture just doesn't accord with our deepest intuitions about how the world really is. I think we know, and forgive me for getting like super emotional here, but like, I lost my father, a couple years ago, the one who introduced me to apologetics. And I remember, at that time thinking about just the value of life. Like, I can't, my deepest intuitions tell me that my dad was valuable. He wasn't just a bag of biochemicals in his hand that has transitioned to some other form. I think our deepest intuitions tell us something different than that. But I don't think atheism can account for why. So, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciated her honesty and her transparency, because it shows that she's being consistent in
Sure.
her thinking. Not that any of us want her to commit the S word, right? That's
Right.
ultimately the opposite of what we want her to have, right?
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
but she's being honest with these ideas that she's having. If life has no meaning, then why am I even here? Like, what is the purpose of being a social justice worker? For who? Like, what is justice in a world without God? There is no justice.
No, it just, everything just is. It just is what it is. And I mean, the reality is, if this is going to sound somewhat crazy, but if there is no God, and I do think God is the best explanation for objective morality. But if you take objective morality, oh, thank you, Jeremy. If you take objective morality out of the picture, then you really can't justify why you think slavery was wrong. Actually, evolution presents us with a picture of survival of the fittest. Even at the expense of other beings. And so, actually, slavery and racism that went with it was right in line with the evolutionary picture. If that's all we have to say about the world is evolution or something like that, then it becomes difficult to explain why you think Frederick Douglass was right, contending against slavery, right? But I think we know that deep down that's not true. I think that when it comes to our moral intuitions, we know that human beings do indeed have have objective value and dignity, but the fact that those things can't really square with a bare knuckle acceptance of atheism, I think is a testament to the fact that atheism doesn't accord with reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I haven't read a whole lot of Charles Darwin, but I read some of his work, and it seems as though he used his atheism or his view on evolution to degrade Black people or people of color. I don't know if have you read Descent of Man or anything like that?
I know exactly. Well, I won't say I've read the whole thing. It's like super, but I think I know where you're going.
Yeah. But the point is like he didn't see us or certain people in Africa as humans. They became animals, and if someone is an animal, then why can't I capture them and make them a slave?
Or even worse in Darwin's case, because actually in the Descent of Man, he goes on to say that he believed that the quote unquote civilized races of man would eventually exterminate the so-called uncivilized or savage races. So, to your point, the savage races would be people that look like, me and you, so he believed that an outworking or natural outworking of his framework would be the eventual extermination of, the so-called savage races. Now, what's interesting is that there's another gentleman by the name of Josiah Wedgwood. And I'm sure people have probably seen it if they've done any, history on this, but in the abolitionist movement, the bat symbol, if you will, the McDonald's sign of the abolitionist movement was like the picture or pottery piece of the slave with the praying hands, kind of look it up and you would see this caption that says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Often coupled with it. And it was really kind of hearkening back to this notion of the Imago Dei that you find in the book of Genesis. And so there was a guy by the name of Josiah Wedgwood who's credited for, coming up with that piece, and framing it around that biblical idea. So what's fascinating is actually Josiah Wedgwood is Charles Darwin's grandfather, So what's fascinating is you have two people, same family tree, right? But two radically different ideas about human persons, one coming from a biblical perspective, the other coming from an outworking of what he believed naturalism entailed, So again, ideas matter. Worldviews matter. These are not questions that we can just kind of throw up in the air and wait for them to sort themselves out. We really have to think critically about these things.
Would you say it's common for you to have these kind of conversations with? Well, okay, maybe I can reframe the question. How often do you come in contact with Black people who are atheists?
I guess like in real life, like non-social media. Not super often, but I do come in. I think more often I come in contact with people who have accepted certain beliefs that correspond to atheism, but they may not have taken it, hook, line, and sinker. You know what I'm saying? Most of the folks that I encounter who are, Black atheists are typically like folks online.
Yeah, it's not common for me either, but there are some very near and dear people to my heart who are Black that are atheists. And so like I'm constantly worrying, like, how do I give the best defense? How do I have these conversations? I don't know as much as a William Lane. I don't know a fraction of what William Lane Craig knows,
Well, yeah,
like,
me neither.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around your chapter of the book. So it's like, how do we navigate through conversations with atheists who seem to have it all together if we don't know it all? Can you give us some tips on that?
Yeah, I think that number one, in most cases, hopefully it's somebody that you have a relationship with. Typically, I'm just not a big fan of like the McDonald's Happy Meal version of apologetics, where we hope we're going to just give somebody like a 3-point answer, and then that's the end of it. I'm not saying that God can't do that. God can work through that, absolutely, or else I probably wouldn't be doing it. But most often, I think it's just helpful to come alongside people, and to help them to kind of think through things, establishing a rapport, doing a good job of listening to understand why it is that they hold to the views that they do. Because I mean, many of them don't like to hear this, but I'll just say in my experience, many people who initially present like some sort of intellectual problem, when you talk to them after a while, you realize that the problem is not necessarily intellectual, but it's something emotional. It's something that has to do with maybe experiencing some form of suffering, or even in some cases, I might even say many cases, they want to make some lifestyle decisions that they know is not in accord with God, what they understand about morality from a theistic perspective. So just really talking to folks and understanding exactly what it is that their issue is, and in your own mind kind of pacing yourself. Don't try to answer every single question that they have. I think sometimes we can get stuck in trying to just like argue every single point, when it actually usually works better just to kind of stay on like one particular issue if possible, and take your time and talking things through. And to be honest, you can never neglect the power of prayer. I mean, you really can't. I can tell you straight up, I've had experiences, and this is like before I was even doing like apologetics for real, but just doing like street witnessing kind of stuff. I encountered a guy, I'm thinking about him right now in college, where he straight up told me, said, man, I don't care if God appears in my living room in a burning bush today. I'm still, not going to be, not going to serve him. You know what I mean? I kid you not. I saw that guy a year later. He was a Christian. You know what I mean?
Wow.
Straight up. Now, I don't know if God appeared to him in a burning bush or not. You know what I mean? But it is living. Maybe he did. I don't know. But praying for folks, man. Like, God cares about people. God is pursuing people infinitely more than we ever could. And I think that we really can't neglect the power of prayer, just really calling for God to woo him, to woo people to himself. It's a very real thing.
Yeah, it's funny. He talks. Well, a lot of atheists say that, well, if God is real, let him just show himself. Like, I need to see a miracle. But they already believe in the miracle that either the universe came into existence by itself, or it's just always eternally existed. It's like, okay.
Right.
But when we read in like the book of Exodus, Pharaoh saw all these miracles and nothing phased him. He still was like, nah, like, it's about me, fam. Forget Yahweh. So it shows us that miracles are not what convinces people that God is real. I mean, if we look at creation, that should be enough.
Should be.
It's not enough for some people for some reason, but it should be. But that's interesting. I'm so glad that God saved your friend.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, he was a wild dude. But I will say this too. I think that sometimes, and this might be on the fault of Christians to some extent. I think we can take some blame here. Sometimes we don't present the gospel in terms of what it is exactly that God is requiring of us. Because, when it comes to belief, you know what I mean? The biblical authors, particularly in the New Testament, they're not talking about just some sort of mental acknowledgement that God exists or something like that, that it's a fact that God exists. That's not what they're talking about. When they're using that word pistis, or faith, to believe, it's actually more something akin to when a husband and wife say I do at the altar. I'm saying it's a giving over of allegiance of oneself to another. That's really what we're talking about, that kind of trust, if you will. And so it's not just a matter of coming to believe that God exists, but really what the scriptures are calling us to is not just that, but also a submission of oneself to that God. And that's a whole different ball game, right? So God could give you a miracle, to of whatever sort, and maybe you would believe that he exists, but it's a different thing to, as an act of your will in some sense or another, to say, okay, I'm going to bow my knee to that God. And that's where the crux of the issue really is.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Well, that brings me to our final TikTok for the evening. This is a little sad. Y'all, people on TikTok are kind of ruthless with the debate. Right. This is between a Christian and an atheist. So I'm gonna like pause to maybe we can give some commentary in between.
Okay, cool.
Kind of long too.
Yeah.
See. So this guy said he doesn't believe in our God because of lack of evidence. Bro, take a look around you. The evidence is all around. You are just blinded to the truth.
First of all, if I had a nickel for every time somebody said I was blinded to the truth, I would have enough to own an optometrist's office.
2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4. The God of this age, which is Satan, has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God.
Second, don't ever use the Bible to prove the Bible. That's not how it works. If I said that wizards were real, and the only proof I had of that was the collection of Harry Potter books, would you accept that as evidence? No, you wouldn't. Because that doesn't prove anything. It doesn't. So why would you use the Bible to prove your God's existence? It doesn't.
Do you think
TikTok is a wild place, man. TikTok is a wild place, bro. It's like the Wild West of social media, but okay.
is that a valid argument? Because I've heard this before too. Like, you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. Is that fair?
Well, I think what we have to be careful about is people like reframing our points to say something. It's like basically it's like a straw man argument, making a straw man argument of what we're saying. Because actually, first of all, the guy says, the Caucasian gentleman, he said the evidence is all around you, right? And then, he says, but you're blind to it. And then he pulls out a scripture, speaking about that blindness. He's not trying to prove the Bible with the Bible. He's simply explaining to you from his perspective and from his worldview why he believes that you're blind. He's not trying to prove anything at that point. So when the gentleman, the black guys were finally like, oh, don't prove the Bible with the Bible. Well, he's actually not even doing that. Yeah. He's just explaining to you from his perspective why it is that he believes that you're blind. And so I said that to say, when it comes to explaining or just giving a reference point for why we believe what we believe, there's nothing wrong with that, particularly, of going to the scriptures to explain why we believe what we believe. Now, people can disagree. They don't have to, take it as true. But if you have two people of differing worldviews and they're putting on the table what they appeal to to articulate their perspective, there's nothing wrong with that at all. The other side of it is too, you don't have to be, put it this way, I'm trying to say this sensibly, you don't have to assume that the Bible is true to pull something out of it that could be used as evidence to support the belief that God exists or that Christianity is true. Okay. So for example, there are some people who make a particular argument for the resurrection, and they draw from certain pieces of scripture, as well as certain pieces of historical text, right, from the first century or second, third century. And they're saying, hey, even if you don't believe that the scriptures are true, let's just take these documents as primary sources. And what do we derive from that? That's totally appropriate. That's totally appropriate. But I think what happens is, quite frankly, especially on the internet, there's just like a lot of atheist slogans, that people are kind of just in knee-jerk fashion, just throwing around like, oh, you can't prove the Bible with the Bible. It was like, no, I'm not even doing it. I'm just explaining to you why I'm saying what I'm saying. You know what I mean? Like, slow down, bro. I think this is kind of a case of that,
And do you think it's fair for him to compare the Bible to a book of wizards and what Harry Potter or so whatever he said?
No, I mean, so I think that I get the comedy of it. I understand, but is that an intellectually honest comparison? No, because we're talking about two different genres of literature. Now, whether you believe that the Bible is true or not, was it the intent of the biblical authors to write something fictional? I'm saying there doesn't seem to be any reason to think that. Right. Particularly, I'm thinking about like, the Gospels, for example. Were they intending to write a fictional story that was akin to, Harry Potter? No. We do know that the author of Harry Potter was intending to write something fictional, and did not in any way intend for anybody to believe it to be, true or factual or something like that. These are two different genres of literature. So I think that if you're being intellectually honest, again, it's funny, but is it intellectually honest? No, I don't think it's an intellectually honest comparison.
Yeah, because there's just so much that has been historically verified, like events that have taken place in the Bible. It's like, these are real people. These events happen. So it's not the same as a Harry Potter book. Nice try.
Not at all. Not at all. Right. Nice try. Right.
All right.
Makes sense.
And also, if we had physical proof of God's existence, which there is evidence, but if we had physical proof there would be no point of having faith. Because in 2 Corinthians 5:7, it says, "For we live by faith, not by sight."
Let me ask you, how is it faith if you're already working on the assumption that God is real? If God is real to you, you think that hell is real already. So you're going to do things that is going to avoid you going to hell. So you're not doing things out of your free will, per se. You're doing it because you want to avoid torture. So that deletes the argument of saying that you have faith, because you don't work under faith. You work under the assumption of knowing that God exists.
Man,
What? That's wild. That's wild. Right. I don't know.
Like 10 questions in one, and that's why it'd be hard. Not because what they're saying is necessarily a great argument, but it
Right.
keeps building. So
Yeah. I mean, well, actually, I think in this part, I think he lost track of his own argument, to be honest with you. I really do. Because, like, if you think about what he said, it actually, like, A plus B does not equal C in terms of how he argued, for that. So he started out by saying that you're working off the assumption of faith. And then I guess as an example of that, he talks about, or I guess maybe an example or expression of that, he talks about, if you believe in God, then automatically you believe in hell. Well, actually, that's not really true. There's a bunch of people that believe in God that don't believe in hell. So that negates his point right there. It's not true that theism, the affirmation that God exists, somehow entails that hell exists. So I don't know where he got that from. But anyway, aside from that, the notion that you could be living in such a way to avoid hell, first of all, I don't believe that most Christians are just, Christians for fire insurance. I don't think that's true. At least that's not what the Bible says anyway. It doesn't say, that's not what's offered in the Christian worldview. Anyway, I don't think that, just because you have, some reason for why you do or don't follow God, that has nothing to do with whether you, like the faith question. You know what I'm saying? Like, you could have faith and believe in hell. You can have faith and not believe in hell. You know what I mean? That this is, one is not contingent on the other. And it's kind of hard to keep track of where he was trying to go with that. But I think that's because he probably lost track of his own argument, so I don't know. And then another thing he said too, is that, like, he said, you're working off of the assumption that God exists. And that's a really big assumption on his part, because somebody like myself, I believe that God exists, but it's not an assumption. I believe that God exists, for various different reasons, including the evidences that God exists. Now I wouldn't have put it the way that the Caucasian brother put it about physical proof. I think the way he worded that, he kind of put a target on his back in that one. But to say that there are evidences for which we believe that God exists, I mean, that's a pretty, low bar to set. I mean, I have evidence that points to God exists. It's not an assumption for me. So the fact that he kind of characterized everybody under this umbrella of having some sort of assumption that God exists, and that being somehow contrary to faith, I don't even know where he got that from, but that's a pretty big, kind of broad brush to say about all those who affirm that God exists. That's kind of crazy.
Yeah, it seems like at the heart of the question, he's saying, I don't want your Bible as any kind of proof. Like, there's nothing in the scriptures that you can use to convince me. So therefore, I need something tangible, which, I mean, we do have evidence like the universe and all these types of things. That why they throw out evidence a lot. It's like, well, I don't like that evidence. I don't like that evidence. I don't see no evidence. So stop trying to tell.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I mean, but to your point, there's plenty of arguments. As a matter of fact, I can't really think of too many apologists who make arguments for God's existence that rely upon the scriptures. I'm saying, like, whether that be, again, we talked about the cosmological argument earlier, but you have the teleological argument, all various forms of that, the fine tuning of the universe and how mathematics maps onto physical reality. And we can talk about the argument from consciousness, argument from morality. There's all sorts of arguments for God's existence that don't include the data of scripture as being a premise or some sort of evidence needed for those arguments to go through. And so I don't know why he thinks that, I don't know what he's talking about. I really don't know. I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt, but I think he's kind of wrong-headed. You know what I mean?
All right, we're gonna let him ask or respond to one more question.
Okay.
To hell by not believing. Man goes to hell by the choices and actions they make here on earth. But what you got to realize is God gave us free will. You have the choice to believe, or you have the choice to do what you want.
Yes, your God gave us free will, but also an ultimatum. Worship me or be tortured. How is that a choice? Please, you don't willingly choose to get tortured. No one does. Your God pushed people into a corner. Worship me or burn. That is never going to be a free will choice. Anyone in their right mind would choose to worship God because they don't want to be tortured. Let me ask you, would you still believe in God if the threat of hell wasn't a thing? Or better yet, would you still believe in God even though there was no way you can go to heaven? You are all destined to go to hell, tortured together. Would you still believe then? If you had no promise of eternal paradise or no safety from eternal damnation, would you still believe? Doesn't seem much of a choice.
Doesn't seem much of a choice.
Okay. All right. Oh man. So I mean, well, first of all, the existence of God is not contingent upon, my personal psychology on what I would do or what I would believe, whether hell or does exist or not. Like that's a totally separate question. You know what I mean? So I think he's, first of all, again, he's just asking the wrong question. A better question would be, hey, let's take a look at what you believe to be evidence of God and just kind of comb our way through it. That'd be the better way to go about it. But anyway, again, I think we had to be very careful in general, not just with atheists, but any sort of unbeliever. We had to be very careful about allowing other people to dictate to us what we believe, right? We need to know what it is that we believe so that when somebody articulates what they put on the table as being our view and it's false, we can correct that, right? So when he says that essentially God has made it such, it's either you worship me or burn, well, that's a very watered down, inaccurate perspective of what the Bible actually says. I'm saying, like, a Christian who's well versed in their theology would understand that's a caricature. He's presented a caricature of what it is that the scriptures actually said and what Christians actually believe. What's actually the case is that God is offering a relationship with him. And when it comes, it's not worship or burn. It's the fact that lordship and being in a position of worship towards God, that's what it means to rightly position yourself in relationship with him. So God has offered himself. He's the ultimate good, what some philosophers would call the incommensurable good, a good that cannot be counterbalanced or measured against anything else. He's offered himself as an incommensurable good to be experienced by you for an eternity, right? And the issue is, if you don't want to do that, then he honors that choice, right? That's the issue. So it's not like worship me or burn. It's be in a relationship with me for eternity or don't. That's what's on the table, right? And so I think that what he does is he creates like this kind of mangled version of Christian theology. And again, I'm not advocating these views, but I mean, not all people who profess to be Christians believe in what's called eternal conscious torment. Some people believe in some sort of annihilationism or what have you. So it's like he's kind of picking at like secondary views and not really getting down to the meat of the issue. But ultimately, again, just kind of be more succinct, it's not about either worship me or burn. It's you can either enter into eternal relationship with me or not. That's what we're talking about here. And if you choose not to, then I mean that's just what it is. He claims that nobody in their right mind would choose torture or however he framed it. But I'm gonna be honest with you, I know a lot of people who've done a lot of stupid things. You know what I'm saying? In the face of clear and unavoidable consequences. Like I know a lot of people who've done some things where there's no way they're going to get away with it. And I mean, they do it anyway, so maybe they're crazy. Maybe you could classify them that way. But this idea that nobody would ever make a unhealthy choice that was unhealthy to them in light of being aware of the consequences, I think that's just not true. I think people do that all the time, actually. Every time I pull up to a McDonald's, drive-through, I know that cheeseburger and those fries are probably not going to be good for my cholesterol level. You know what I'm saying? I know that, but I do it anyway. You know what I mean? So that's just the reality of it. We make bad choices all the time.
Yeah. And I think some of his objections kind of just lead to more questions or more flaws within his worldview, because if God is good, but yet evil exists, can he really be good if there is no hell, if there is no punishment for evil? And it also makes me wonder, like, why wouldn't you want to do good? Because I mean, if we're going to, or if people are going to hell because of sin, why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't they go to hell for sin? Why do you want
Right.
sinners to get away with evil acts? That doesn't seem like anything a good God should allow. So,
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of the gospel, really, is that, you know, at the cross you have this intersection of both mercy and justice, you know, in a way that I think is in no way anticipated by, you know, just our own reasoning. You know what I mean? Like, you know, this is you know, God offering himself for the sins of mankind. You know what I'm saying? Again, this intersection between mercy and justice. To your point, if you have, you know, I don't know, child molesters and murderers and all manner of evil folks just kind of getting off scot-free just cause, you know, with nobody paying the penalty, then that seems pretty unjust, you know. But then at the same time, it does seem that mercy, um, in some sense, necessarily flows from love, right? And so I think that's the beauty of the cross, and where you have the offering of both. You know, nobody gets off scot free, you know, but at the same time, mercy is available, you know, for those who submit themselves. So he's leaving so much out of you know, the real biblical picture, and just kind of condensing it down to this caricaturized view. I think that what I would encourage people to do is just kind of watch out for that. You know what I'm saying? And just don't let somebody paint you in the corner with something that Christians don't even believe. You know what I'm saying?
yeah, and it just also seems that he's assuming that people would be good if God didn't exist. But like human history has shown us that people are pretty awful to each other, like all
Yeah,
the time. Like I don't know of any society where there's not at least some rules. Why do you
of
need
course.
rules, right? Because
Right.
nobody wants their stuff stolen, nobody wants to be attacked. Everybody wants to have their basic needs met. And if there is no order, if there are no rules, then you don't have a society that can last.
Yeah, I think that it's funny because, like, if you get if I've often if some people ask, like, if you had a superpower, like what superpower would you want? You know what I mean? And I think that many people would want to think of themselves as being like a superhero, but I think most of us, if we had superpowers, we'd probably be out robbing a bank somewhere. You know what I mean? Like, if there's no guy who's like, you know, I might start out, you know, walking some old lady across the street, but man, I don't know. I'm trying to get that bread though. You know what I mean? If left to ourselves, we have a tendency to not live well. I'll just put it that way. You know, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. And I think that just again, this is just another feature of the human experience. I think is inescapable. There's something truly broken in mankind. That doesn't mean that mankind is invaluable. That doesn't mean that mankind doesn't have, you know, dignity. But just a short look at the evening news, you can see that there's something that's really gone wrong. You know, the biblical picture is that the issue is sin. You know, we are unfortunately all steeped in sin, and we need something beyond ourselves, someone, I should say, beyond ourselves to really do a reparative work. And that's exactly, you know, what Jesus Christ offers.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. Well, this is the part of the show where I ask the audience if they have any quick questions for our guests.
Cool. Yeah.
And if y'all do have a question, please put question in front of the question. And while you're doing that, please give this video a thumbs up. Please.
There we
Appreciate it.
go. Yeah, yeah.
Give this video a thumbs up. And
I'm
if
gonna
you
do it
guys,
right now.
yeah, oh, thank you so much. And if anyone wants
Oh,
to support me, if
oops, my
anyone
bad.
wants to support the channel, no, you all good, bro. You my guest. It's fine. Cash at Miss Titus, or you can leave a super chat if that's the deal. But while we're waiting on the questions to roll in, Adam, can you tell us where can we find you on social media? What platforms do you have available at the moment?
For sure, yeah. So of course I'm here on YouTube, so you can go to youtube.com/ True Idea Apologetics. Also I'm on Facebook. I am on Instagram, but I'm like super lazy on Instagram. So I would encourage you to check me out on Facebook and Instagram. I think I'm the real Adam Coleman on each of those. And Twitter as well. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. If you feel so inclined to, you know, support the ministry, definitely hit me up at patreon.com/ Adam Coleman. True Idea Apologetics is a 501c3 ministry. So if you give, then that's definitely something you can take off from your taxes. So, you know, yeah, definitely hit me up.
Awesome. Are you ever gonna jump on the TikTok? Because
You know, I'm on TikTok. I've just been
okay.
really like slacking with it. I got like 2 videos, you know what I mean? And so, so the short answer is yes. You're saying like, yeah, people can probably tell from this interview right here, like being brief is not my strong suit. You know what I mean? So I'm working on a couple scripts to put something out there in snippet form to make it work on TikTok. So yeah, I'm be there. I'm gonna be there.
I feel you. I had TikTok for maybe like a year before I really figured out like how can I use this to my advantage. So now I'm kind of like,
Yeah.
okay, I think I'm finding my footing a little bit.
Oh yeah, definitely. You do your thing. Yeah, I like to get there too. I'm trying to get there.
All right, Nate has put up your Patreon information, so y'all make sure if y'all want to support my guests, please do, because as you can see, this is an amazing interview. I don't see any questions rolling in. I'm gonna give y'all just
wow,
a second.
That's like a first.
It's because you answered them so well.
I don't know about that.
How about this? While we give them another minute, can you name some of your favorite apologists?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, of course, shout out to Damon Richardson. You know what I mean? Shout out to my guy, Eric Mason. I know Eric Mason be saying he's not an apologist pastor, but he know he apologized. So I'm putting him in that category. You know what I mean? Shout out to those guys. Definitely have been influenced greatly by, William Lane Craig. Shout out to Frank Turek. I mean, those guys were so formative in how I got into apologetics. Actually, my all-time favorite is my guy Richard Swinburne. And it's not necessarily because I agree with everything he says, but I like this is like super side note, but I'm a big fan of battle rap. Mm-hmm. And for whatever reason, Swinburne just reminds me of like a battle rapper. Like if you see him interact with people, like in forums and stuff like that, like if somebody disagrees with him, he's like right back at him. You know what I mean? As old as he is, like he don't let nothing slide. And I just always appreciate that about him. So he's actually my favorite guy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Phil Fox, for the super chat. Appreciate it, bro.
Phil Feezy. All right.
And we have a question from James Booker. He says, how do you answer if there is a good God, why are there earthquakes and other natural disasters that kills legions of what?
Against people. Right.
But overall, the question is natural disasters. If God is good, why does that happen?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. So one of the things, actually I have a series on my channel, where I kind of walk through the problem of evil in about 4 different episodes. So I would definitely encourage you to check that out. The snippet answer is no matter what worldview you hold, whether you're a Christian, Buddhist, atheist, or whatever it is, everybody has to grapple with the issue of suffering, and evil in the world, and give an explanation as to why it's the case, and what could be an answer to like the question like that. Yes, he said people in there. So I think that if you remove God from the picture, then you actually end up creating a bigger problem than you solve. Because I think you actually remove the main resource that you need to even make sense of the question. Because if there's no God, like we talked about earlier, I don't think that we have a good answer as to why people are valuable. So I think to even establish the value that's necessary to understand that question, I think you have to have God in the picture. But then it becomes, well, if God is in the picture, like how could he allow something like that? And there's lots of different answers to that. I'm going to try to give a snippet version. It's not going to do it entirely injustice, but I'll just give two answers, if you will. One, the Bible paints a picture of human responsibility, in some sense or another, both in terms of what's referred to as natural evil, meaning just evil like earthquakes and things like that, tornadoes or whatever, and moral evil. Like in some sense, those things seem to be tied to the issue of sin. We live in a broken world. The Bible paints a picture as though God did not intend for people to die like that, or to be plagued by things like that. But in the brokenness of man, we've opened the door for those kinds of tragedies to happen. And so I do think that when it comes to the gospel, the idea is that it's actually kind of a solution to both. On a personal level, sin is addressed, in the individual, but also, God is ushering mankind toward a new heaven and a new earth, where those kinds of things won't be a part of the picture, and so ultimately that'll be resolved alongside his justice and mercy. And so that's kind of the overarching picture of what it is that God is trying to do. He's resolving personal sin and then also the effects of sin in the world as he creates that new heaven and new earth. But aside from that, I do think that there's this notion of we might call soul building. I do think that there are certain moral goods, particularly in regard to character, that seem to not be able to come about, or be made apparent in a world where there is absolutely like no evil, So for example, like what would it mean for Dr. King to be courageous if there were no Bull Connor? You know what I'm saying? Like, what would it mean for, someone to have courage, without some sort of threat, that sort of a thing. There's certain moral goods that are made apparent against the backdrop of some level of evil, And so I do think that God allows us to be in the kind of world where we can mature in those kinds of goods, and it's ultimately towards this end of walking with him for eternity, along with the kind of character that's becoming of somebody that's made in the image of God. So that's kind of like more of like a kind of quasi soul building approach. Again, I'm kind of just giving a snippet version. I mean, volumes have been written on this issue, and there's various different answers that are at the Christian's disposal. And I think when you put them together, you have a complete picture that answers those kinds of questions. But that's kind of just like my snippet answer there.
Yeah, that's comforting to know that Christianity, like there is a solution to this overarching problem of evil and death, and Jesus is that solution. So praise God, we got a solution. I don't think atheism has a solution really to anybody's problems, both for the here and now and for eternity.
Well, I agree. Yeah, if atheism is true, then I mean it don't matter anyway. Like whoever dies in those earthquakes or whatever is just, doesn't really matter, I think, ultimately speaking. But to your point, I mean, I think that's the answer that the book of Job gives. Job spends 30 plus chapters trying to reason his way through the issue of suffering in his own life, but ultimately his concern is resolved by a personal encounter with God, right? And I think that when it comes to specifically issues of like suffering, what we're proposing, we're not putting a worldview on the table. We just have like a set of facts that you hold to. We're trying to introduce you to a person, the person of Jesus Christ, right? There's a personal answer to the problem of evil that I think that no matter how you reason your way through it, you'll still end up coming short without that personal encounter with the true and living God. So.
All right. Well, I got some more super chats that came in.
Okay, cool.
Thank you so much for the super sticker. Appreciate it. And Typical says, my friends and I just watched Unspoken. Do we need to talk to anybody or pay extra to do free screening? Any Chicago support to help us? I'm not sure if you can answer that, but.
Oh, yeah. So actually, you want to holler Don Carey. I think his information is on the website. I think it's unspokenmovie.com, I believe. And so, yeah, Don Carey would be the one who's heading up all inquiries about, showings and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. Awesome.
Okay, Jessica Hall says, can a Christian be friends with an atheist?
Sure. And so I think that and this is an interesting question. So the careful thing, you want to be careful. The Bible does talk about how, bad character corrupts, a bad company can corrupt good character. So, I mean, I don't encourage people to befriend folks who are, I'm not saying all atheists are like that, but if your friend is running a meth lab, you know what I mean? And that's probably not the kind of person you want to be hanging around, things like that. But no, I do believe that God allows for certain boundaries to be in place, yet you can have some sort of social relationship with an unbeliever. Absolutely. I think that's all throughout the New Testament. Even, Paul even says in one instance, I can't recall the exact chapter and verse, but he says something like, when you go over your friend's house and they offer you food from idols or something like that, and so it's not like if you go, but when you go, so he's kind of assuming that you're interacting with people who are not of the faith. You know what I mean? But there are instances like that throughout the scriptures. Even Jesus, was interacting with people who were clearly ungodly. But I think that, again, I'm not trying to say you should just hang out with just anybody, but I think that's just in general, atheists or not, you don't want to be hanging out with people who would draw you away from, the walking with God rightly. So,
All right. DFC says, is it a disingenuous question to ask why atheism teaches that nothing doesn't actually mean an absence of anything?
Yeah. So I guess now I'm going to be like kind of a stickler, when it comes to like language. That's one of the things I like about philosophy is that it's kind of like, it's all about precision of language. So I wouldn't say that like atheism teaches like ... You know what I mean? Because you have atheists who have, various different perspectives on various different things. So you got to be careful about making statements like that. But I do think that and maybe I'm reading too much into his question, but like somebody like a Lawrence Krauss, for example, he kind of made a lot of waves. So Lawrence Krauss is a physicist, scientist guy who's certainly no friend of the faith, definitely an atheist, and he wrote a book where he essentially used the term nothing to refer to like the quantum vacuum. I know it's getting like super nerdy, but the quantum vacuum meaning like that base level of existence of physical stuff, you know what I mean? In some sense that, the universe is based on. Anyway, a lot of people got on him because it's just a inappropriate use of the term nothing. Nothing is exactly what it means. No thing. It's a state of absolute negation. That's what it means. And if somebody wants to use it in a different sense, then I think we can rightly challenge them and say that's you're just using the word wrong. I think it's really that simple.
Nate says, but if you find out that you're friends with someone with a meth lab because they're Breaking Bad, then you better call Saul.
Better call Saul.
Nate, I can't. Right. Pastor Booker, thank you so much for the super chat. I really appreciate it. All right, I got 2 more questions from the same person.
Cool.
Kanaya says, what do I do if a friend does not believe in the Bible, also not in Jesus? How do I go about that?
Yeah. So again, I think, the most important thing is, first of all, we have to know what it is that we believe and why we believe it. Study your word. I'm saying take advantage of the different resources that are out there to equip yourself so that you'll be able to, navigate those conversations. Like, don't necessarily put yourself in a situation where you're kind of painted in a corner, you know what I mean? And aren't equipped for it. Take some time to study a bit, take some time to really, dig into, what it is that we believe and why we believe it. That being said, coming alongside folks, trying to figure out what it is that's driving. Like, what does that person believe in? Where does their their worldview point to? And I, this might sound super simple, but I say, don't give up on the gospel. You know what I mean? Like listen, I study apologetics every day, all day. You know what I'm saying? I really do. Like, the way that I am on camera, that's really how I am. If I'm not changing diapers, one of my 5 kids, I'm studying apologetics. That's just my thing. But I'm telling you, man, like not everybody needs a deep apologetics, argument. You know what I'm saying? Start with the gospel. And you can ask that person at what point, like, what is it that they disagree with? If you don't believe in the Bible, okay, well, why not? If you don't believe that Jesus, existed, why not? Let's talk about the evidence for Jesus' existence. Let's talk about, Tacitus and Suetonius and, Josephus and some of these different, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century sources that we can, look to establish the existence of Jesus. Let's talk about, findings, or just pieces of scripture where archaeological finds have corroborated what the scriptures attest to and things like that. You can have those kind of conversations. But ultimately, I just say, don't give up on the gospel. You know what I'm saying? I think as apologists, as Christians, sometimes we're far too quick to do that. Oh, I think you might be muted.
I muted myself. I was over here grabbing a book, knocked my whole bookshelf over. It's all
snap.
But
yeah, I heard something crash. I was like, oh snap.
I'm still alive, guys. I promise. I wanted to show her this book because I think this is a great place to start after you've taken Adam's advice and read the Bible, because we do need to be very comfortable navigating through the scriptures. Like, start there. And then after, if you want to go a step further, this is a great starting place. I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Geisler and Frank Turek. This was super helpful to me. And it talks about, the science, some of the scientific stuff we talked about tonight, and also the reliability of the scriptures, how we know that the New Testament claims are true and reliable. So I think that's a good place to start. All right.
Sure.
Kanai says, why does the Bible go against astrology? I'm not sure if you can answer this one, but we're going to try anyway. Why does the Bible go against astrology if what it says about you is true? Like, is it an illusion so that we believe in it?
Man, that's a deep. we got to do a whole show on that, But so I guess part of the assumption is that it says, why does the Bible go against astrology if what it says about you is true? I would probably really challenge that part about it says if what it says about you is true, right? Because I've had people, read my, sign or whatever and say things about me that's totally untrue. So like, so is it true for everybody? And if it's not true for everybody, then wouldn't that mean that we have good reason to doubt it? So I think actually astrology is not nearly as reliable as some people might think it is. But that being said, if for some reason you're reading, some sort of astrology resource, I don't know, people do I don't know what people are doing, but some sort of astrology, something, you know what I mean? And you believe that it to have said something true about you. Um, our experience doesn't debunk, God's word. You know what I'm saying? Like we can experience lots of different things, you know what I'm saying? But our I guess I'm trying to say there's some sort of there are truths that are higher than our experience. That's a better way to put it. And I think that the Bible presents to us truths about the way that the world is that aren't subject to our experiences. So sometimes, maybe to put it a slightly different way, it's putting the cart before the horse to interpret the Bible through the lens of our experience. We actually should be interpreting our experiences through the lens of God's revealed truth, i.e., the Bible. And so you don't want to get those things reversed. I also do believe, and I'm just, you know, feel free to to cut me off at this point if you want to, Titus. But I do believe that the Bible presents to us a very real um, spiritual realm. I mean, there's a very real spiritual war that's going on. So think about it. I'll end with this. If you think about the account where Moses he goes to Pharaoh's like, let my people go, and so on and so forth. One of the miraculous signs that God gave Moses was to cast his staff down, and his staff became a serpent, right? It then says that some of the wizards or magi or whatever on the Egyptian side, they cast down their staffs, right? And their staffs became serpents. Now, it didn't say that there was some sort of trickery and it appeared to become a serpent, or that or anything like that. It says no, their staffs became serpents too, and then Moses' staff serpent devoured the others, thus showing that God is the one and true God. The point that I'm trying to make is that there are very real spiritual powers that go against God's kingdom. That's a reality of it, right?
Yeah.
There's a reality to that. So just because you have a spiritual experience, just because you have something that you experience or encounter that you believe lends some sort of credibility to some sort of supernatural aspect of something that's outside of scripture, I mean, that just kind of confirms the fact that there really is a spiritual realm out there, and there are things that can happen that are of a spiritual nature that are against God's kingdom, as in the case with like the serpent. So every spiritual experience isn't a God experience, and one of the things that helps us to discern the difference between just a spiritual experience of a demonic sort and a God experience is what God has revealed in his word. So that just kind of brings me full circle to the fact that we don't want to interpret the scriptures through the lens of our experiences. We interpret our experiences through the lens of scripture. I think that might help.
Nice. Tyler says, will you guys do some discussions about the false teachings from the likes of R. Hagen and K. Wesley? I would like to ask you, Adam, have you already done videos on these? We'll ask it that way.
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I do have and this is back when I was just doing kind of the audio versions of the podcast. I do have an episode where I actually met Ray Hagins. This is this is when I first got started with Apologetics. Ray Hagins was doing some sort of talk about 2 hours from where I lived at the time. And so I hopped in the car and went down there. I was like, oh, word, I'm about to go down that joint. You know what I mean? Like, where at, right? So I get down there, and long story short, I mean, he's a charlatan. You know what I mean? He just is what he is. He's just peddling a bunch of pseudo information. And after his presentation, I told him straight to his face. I said, bro, like, you're a wolf in sheep's clothing, and you need to repent. You know what I mean? I told him straight up. And it's only because I actually didn't even intend to go there with that kind of vibe, but because I was asking him a question and he lied, and I could tell that he was lying. I'm like, bro, you just a false teacher, bro. You know what I mean? And he was like, well, I was like, man, we can debate right now, today, like, today, you know what I mean? We can do that. but he wasn't trying to have it. So anyway, I can just kind of talk about that experience on my channel a little bit. And I have done some stuff on Kevin Wesley. It's been quite some time, but yeah, I know for sure I've done a couple of videos on Kevin Wesley. Shout out to Alex McElroy on Proof of the Truth, because he's also or Pursuit of Purpose, I think, is his YouTube channel, because I've been on his channel discussing Kevin Wesley as well. But I mean, both of those guys, I mean, plain and simple. I mean, they're pseudo scholars at best. They peddle information that is not in any sense backed up by coherent logic or a respect for primary sources, particularly when it comes to history. So, but yeah, check out my YouTube channel.
Nice. Well, with that, I just want to say, Adam, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You, I think, highlighted a lot of good things. Just listening to what people say goes a long way, and having a good footing and understanding of the gospel. If we start there, I think then we'll do just fine, huh?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll be all right.
Well, y'all make sure, first of all, you give my video a thumbs up, please. After this live stream is over, hop in the comments because it helps get the video out. And y'all make sure you subscribe to Adam's channel. Adam, don't you have 2 channels? Or didn't you have 2 channels at one point?
Yeah, I kind of felt I had a brain out, whatever, freeze, whatever. I started a gaming channel for like a hot second. My wife told me not to do it, you know what I mean? And I didn't listen, you know what I mean? So I was like, no, it's gonna be great. Watch, I'm gonna start this Apologetics gaming channel. And I just don't have enough time to sustain it. So I came up with like 2 videos and never did anything else. So that's the other channel. So never mind that one, True ID Gaming. Just ignore that one. Go to True ID Apologetics.
Man,
I should listen to my wife,
You can still game. Let me stop.
Right.
But all right, yeah, y'all make sure y'all subscribe to Adam's channel. Give him some love. And Adam, I just thank you for being here. We're going to call it a night. Y'all be blessed, and I'll catch y'all at the next video.